Greetings, Guardians, my name is Bife here. No lore today on this video, but I encourage you to sit and listen nonetheless, if only because this is an important topic that we should most definitely be talking about. A few days ago, an article was published on IGN detailing the experience of 26 former Bungie employees who would detail what happened when they worked for the company. I encourage you all to read the article in full. Whilst much of it is distasteful to say the least, I think it's also fair to say that the final takeaway from the article is at very least a hopeful one, stating that whilst there has undeniably been unacceptable behaviour at Bungie in the form of a hostile work environment, there is also a genuine will at the studio to change things and to ensure that things are better going forward. In spite of previous bad actors, there is the hope that this is being resolved by the studio, and the acknowledgement that this is a journey that's going to take a long time. Now again, I need to stress this to you all. Please go and read that article. Practically every Bungie employee that I know has publicly stated on social media that the stories should be believed, and for the record, I absolutely believe them as well. It's important to talk about these things because the industry as a whole needs to be held accountable and needs to work towards making changes to become better than what it currently is. I have personally, as a content creator, worked with Bungie for a long time in a variety of capacities, most of them in the instances where I am helping to cover Destiny, and I'm inclined to believe the stories of the people that I've come to either respect professionally or in some cases have come to call my friends. Bungie's CEO, Pete Parsons, also released a statement regarding the article, which is very much worth reading. If nothing else, I think it affirms everything stated in the IGN article, from the fact that the employees absolutely did have poor experiences, from the fact that these experiences were absolutely not acceptable, and also the impression given at the very end, where some employees say that the studio is slowly, although with some struggle, trying to change. I know that in spite of the fact that these stories have been confirmed by many former Bungie employees, and despite the fact that the CEO has made it very clear that he's acknowledging that these employees did have bad experiences, that there may still be some amongst us who are skeptical. To them, I would say that if you don't believe myself or the Bungie employees, listen to Myling Games. Matt has also had an experience working with Bungie as he helped to curate the Grimoire anthologies that have been released, the physical books that now many of us lore lovers have on our shelves. He stated that his experience when working with Bungie most definitely corroborates the stories told by the former Bungie employees. If you are one to disregard the stories of people you don't know, then perhaps his words will sway you. Matt is not only someone who I believe is of unimpeachable moral fibre, but also is well known to us in the lore community, and therefore I hope that if you trust in me, you trust in him as well. Personally, I think I owe it to you all to talk about this at least somewhat, and I think that there are a few reasons for that. The first of them is obvious, and it's something that's so obvious I won't even take as much time up talking about it. Stories like this need to be heard, and we need to keep people accountable because we should not allow them to be repeated, we should not allow them to take place in the first place. As a community, we can make it clear that we don't find these kinds of actions acceptable, and we don't find inaction when such things happen acceptable either, and that we want to ensure that changes going forward are both supported and enacted by the studio at every level. Now, I think that's hardly a controversial point, so I'm not even going to bother trying to enforce it, especially when it's something that we can all agree is bad, regardless of what other kinds of discrimination came with it in the forms of either overt or less overt sexism or racism that were also mentioned as parts of the article. And whilst it wasn't everywhere at Bungie, there were most certainly individuals in leadership positions that were allowed to take part in that activity, and it was certainly something that is not acceptable. We need to hold these people to account, and we need to make sure that we make it clear that it's not okay. That's the obvious part of what we can do, and I think it's probably the most important thing to take away from this video. And again, it's so obvious, and we've said it so many times with regards to the gaming industry and how it needs to change, that I feel like it's honestly not worth talking about much more, because at that point I would be drilling it into you, and it's not something that you necessarily haven't heard. It's something that should, I hope, be obvious, and if nothing else, the takeaway from the article should really be that yes, this kind of stuff is common throughout the gaming industry, and is common throughout many industries, and that we should be working to make sure that it doesn't continue onward. The second thing I'd like to talk about is something I'm going to talk about a lot more, and that applies a lot less to the actual story and more to us as a community. And it's going to diverge off of the topic, and I need to say a few things before I start talking about this. First of all, I don't want to use this as a way of taking away from the main point of the article, which is again that there was indeed a toxic culture at Bungie and that things are starting to change, but not necessarily quickly enough. I think the things that were said in the IGN article are the most important things to take away from this, particularly with regards to the members of the studio themselves. That is the most important point. But in the process of reading that article, particularly with the moment where it started speaking on the narrative team, it was one of these moments at which I sat there and said, what more can I do to help? And I'm sure that's something that a lot of you said as a sentiment to yourselves as well. And honestly, I came to this point at which I sat there and took a look at some of the bits in the article that were very concerning to me as someone who is at the core of the community surrounding the narrative and lore of Destiny. And it's here at which I really want to highlight a few bits of the article and talk about them more. And before we begin again, I don't want this to be some kind of thing where we try to single out specific members of the community or attempt to morally grandstand, because that's, for starters, not helpful and also is absolutely not what I'm trying to do. Instead, I think it's simply something that leads us to a reminder of what we can do as a community to make things better, and how our actions also impact the people at the studio. And again, this is most certainly not the main takeaway from the article, but it's something that we can do to help. So, with all of that in mind, what can we do to help? I'm going to go ahead and read a small portion of the article that relates to the narrative team, and a long excerpt at that, but it's something that helps to give us an idea of what our actions do to the people inside the studio. So go ahead and listen to this long excerpt here. Many of the writers felt they had been backed into a corner after the painful release of Destiny 2's first DLC expansion, Curse of Osiris. Curse of Osiris' story had been lambasted on Reddit, with a few female narrative team members being singled out by the community for harassment, death threats, and vitriol. Our sources say these women didn't receive support inside the studio or from the community team for what they were going through, and multiple sources were aware of one member of leadership still at the studio who emailed Reddit comments about these women to other company leaders in a seeming bid to tear down the narrative team because players didn't like the story. The same leader is also said to have been dismissive during a meeting about the controversy, explaining that no one should be worried because they were just going to bring back the Destiny 1 writing team to solve everything. In fact, multiple people familiar with the writing team related stories of its members being treated poorly by other departments of the studio, being consistently derided when the game was received badly. As a result, the narrative team was afraid of what would happen if it shipped something else that appeared to the community to be incomplete or not up to standard. So they continued to crunch, some of them going so far as to hide the overtime from their leads so they wouldn't enforce story cuts. Crunch was exacerbated by the constant need for revisions and last-minute changes, often worsened by constant conflicts over who had control of the story. Creative direction overall was fraught due to the pull of different groups and powers at the studio. Some of Bungie's old guard were especially precious about the vision of Destiny 1, and reluctant to change anything about the tone, characterization, or direction of the story as the game moved into Destiny 2 and its subsequent expansions. This was especially frustrating for the team in cases where that vision had never been explicitly defined in the game or elsewhere, but only existed as ideas in the heads of people who no longer worked in narrative. So, there's a few takes away from this, and the first of them is, screw those people who made everything worse at Bungie for the narrative team. That's the number one thing, and I feel like the actions of certain actors at the studio again, is still the main takeaway of this article. They have undoubtedly failed the people who worked under them, and also the studio generally, with poor actions that not only contributed to a hostile work environment for the narrative team, but also undoubtedly made Destiny worse, and I'm going to go ahead and continue to talk about that a little bit more. The other thing I want to go ahead and highlight is the most obvious thing, which was stated in one of the first lines in the first paragraphs, which is simply that members of the community were sending harassments and death threats to various narrative team members, singled out, many of them women. And it's got to be our job to hold those people accountable too. The time period in question was undoubtedly one of the most toxic in the history of Destiny. Trust me, I remember it. I was there. It was a depressing time to be a Destiny fan because there was a malaise around the game's community in the wake of player dissatisfaction. And this is one of those moments where I don't say go back into the threads of old, because not only are they probably gone for the sake of Reddit, but it's also one of these moments at which that's probably not helpful. I think the thing that needs to be said is that change going forward is important. In the future, let's go ahead and keep in mind that when we're interacting with the studio in some way, we need to do so appropriately. This is not to say you can't critique the studio. If you think that something is awful, you can go ahead and voice that it's awful. But you need to do so in a way that isn't fueled by invective and fury. I have been in a place where I've not done that well. I have thought in the past that I was being responsible and giving good feedback, but I let emotions get the better of me, and that's not something that's good. It's something that I have definitely failed in earlier in my career as a content creator, and I can confidently say that whilst I'm not one of the demented 1% of people who sent death threats, it certainly doesn't mean that lots of the actions that myself and others partook in didn't add to a degree of toxicity that was then passed on to the narrative team. And as always, it's something else to really shine a light on, which is that toxicity and feedback should have nothing to do with each other, and honestly have nothing to do with each other. If you want to voice actionable change, toxicity is only going to undermine your point. Worse than that, you might actually be helping to create the environment that's making the success of the narrative team harder, and that's something that applies both to us as a community, for those of us who may have not necessarily helped to induce a less toxic environment, and also, of course, to the members of Bungie who were responsible for such terrible actions that put the narrative team in a terrible place like that to start with. Now, if you think that it's some of these things where a toxic environment doesn't really have many effects, I want to go ahead and show you some of the tangible effects which are actually stated in the article. One part of the article in particular states, and I quote, "The narrative team was afraid of what would happen if it shipped something else that appeared to the community to be incomplete or not up to standard, so they continued to crunch, some of them going so far as to hide the overtime from their leads so they wouldn't enforce story cuts." And what is the effect of this crunch? It's also outlined in the article, and spoiler alert, it's not good. The narrative team members hid overtime and crunched more time at the studio working on things, especially at a time when the studio was working to eliminate the practice. And how bad did this get? Another choice snippet of the article tells us, and this is the impact of everything that toxic work environment and any toxicity that we added will have led to. Quote, "Those close to the team describe its members working 60, 70, 80, even 100-hour weeks during some expansions, frequently with no breaks in between crunch periods. One team member crunched while so sick they were unable to type and had to have someone else type for them while they dictated." This is the effect of crunch. And as someone who works in a creative field, I can tell you that trying to work like this impacts the quality of your work. Some of the worst videos I've made that were not necessarily correct to the law, and in fact were not only factually incorrect, but were also lazier than my other videos, failed to consider the law properly, and were made in periods of crunch. I think it's important to acknowledge that whilst we didn't directly do this, and we certainly are not responsible for the actions of the Bungie studio that will have made a toxic work environment, we did still help to create that environment of toxic feedback that put pressure on the employees. Some of us amongst them created those Reddit threads, and we certainly weren't there to say anything to stop all of the things that happened at the studio from happening. We can't be blamed for that. But did we really stand there and say that maybe we shouldn't give feedback like this? I don't think we did either. What's worse, it all could have been done with just feedback, without the need for death threats and vitriol or anything that would put fear into the devs. Now again, I think it's very important to make something clear. This isn't made to be an attack, and I'm not calling out a specific community member for doing this. I think this is more one of those moments in which we can generally remember, let's try and be kinder. And I also don't think it's one of these moments at which I want to sit there and say the entirety of the community around the law has gone ahead and partaken in toxic behavior, because I don't believe that's true. But I certainly do believe that toxic behavior happens. And I think that it's something which we can most certainly look at as a community and say, no, that's not good enough. So what's our responsibility as a community going forward? Well, if we expect Bungie's leadership not to create a toxic work environment, as I think we should, because it's a no-brainer, it's something that makes the game better, something that means that employees aren't unhappy, and something that means that generally speaking we move towards better work environments throughout the industry, there's also something else we need to take away from that, which is that if we're expecting Bungie to create non-toxic work environments, then we should be looking to do the same. To be clear, doesn't mean that when something's bad you don't say it's bad. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't give feedback. Doesn't mean that there are specific parts of the community that have explicitly failed. Does mean we just need to be more conscious of this kind of stuff in the future, because we can see the bad effects of it when it does happen. And we can see that when bad actors are there to exacerbate it, it can come down even harder on the teams in question. I, for one, don't want to read another story about how a Bungie employee was so burnt out while sick that they had to have someone type what they were dictating in order to continue their work. To me, that just speaks to something going completely wrong. Our part in all of this is small, it's minuscule, but I feel like it's fair to say that when it comes to communities and gaming generally, this is a lesson that we can all learn a little bit better. And that goes beyond just Destiny's narrative and lore community alone. I think that, frankly, every side of the Destiny community could take a moment to think a little bit more about whether that's something that happens in their side of the community, whether it does or doesn't. And I think also it's worth taking a look at any gaming community that you're a part of, because ultimately we see the effects of it here. And I don't know about you, but I'm not comfortable with that. Maybe take a small moment to sit and think about it. And that's all I'd ask. Again, this is minor in comparison to the bigger takeaway, which should be listen to the experiences of the employees and ask for that activity to be changed so that those experiences are not repeated for someone else. The smaller but the more impactful takeaway for us, because it's something that we can do, is to simply sit there and as a community ask whether we are creating a little toxicity for the devs. And if we are, maybe work to make that a little bit better. Again, it seems a little bit like an off point when it comes to the overall reach of the article. And again, I encourage you not only to read that article, but also to look at Myling Games' video, because Matt outlines a lot of what he experienced and corroborates a lot of those stories. I think it's also worth acknowledging again that when it comes down to it, there were real problems in the studio, and it's something that should never be undermined. But I think if we're going to be the best kind of community that we can be, something we can sit there and do is just very quickly ask ourselves if we can improve the situation somehow. And in the one instance where this story for the narrative team was outlined, we were a part of the problem. Definitely not the biggest part of the problem, as were the toxic members of Bungie, but certainly not the smallest either. We created an environment that allowed this stuff to happen. And I'm not going to be as naive to say that if they were genuinely terrible employees, that good, honest feedback wouldn't also have been mobilized against these people. But I think it's fair to say that amongst all of that, there was perhaps a little bit more room for grace that we maybe missed out on. Either way, I don't want this to come off as overly accusatory or aggressive. I want this more to be sort of something that gives everyone a little bit more room for reflection on the whole process. And if there's one thing that I really ask you all to do, again, read the articles, read everything that's been put out there on this by IGN, and listen and think about what we can do to make the situation better. I hope this has made the situation better, and I hope that we as a community can use this opportunity to reflect on how we can use our role in this to not only make a better game with Bungie using our feedback, but also can do so in a way that creates a more collaborative atmosphere. I want you all to just imagine the benefits for a second of doing this. DMG and Cosmo now regularly reply to people whose comments ask in a very straightforward manner what's going on. You can see examples of that even as recently as what time the patch for the dungeon and repeatable runs of it is going to come out. I think it's worth taking a look at that and wondering about that same approach when it comes to the narrative team. If I sat down and was able to tweet regularly with Jonathan Toe about things, with the knowledge that it was going to be a purely positive experience for him, I would most certainly do that. In fact, there are moments at which, whenever I get the chance to celebrate the narrative team's victories, I will go ahead and I will retweet those interactions, those tweets, whatever it may be. And I do that now because I have confidence in the idea that it will be a positive interaction, but more importantly, a positive interaction that gives concise feedback where possible. If that is something that we can help to encourage, it's going to be a case where Bungie's employees will feel comfortable reaching back out and then creating that two-way street dialogue. Something that not only is going to be more exciting for people to engage in because they get to hear more about the game they love, but also something in which it's going to be easier for us to give feedback on things we didn't like. This is the entire point of why I think we can ultimately do better, is not only because it's something that shuts down bad behaviors and makes everything better, but also because it's going to allow us to all engage with something we love in a better, more meaningful way. So again, hopefully all of this makes sense. I hope it's something that doesn't fall on deaf ears, and at the same time I hope that it's been received well and that I haven't screwed something up here. Talking on a topic like this required a more serious tone, and I hope I got that right. If not, then please do let me know in the comments section down below. Again, I know I've thrown it at you many times, but please read the article. It's very important, and I hope that when it comes down to it, we can continue to improve everything on our end, as little as we may. Either way, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.